What's up everyone, it's Jonny from Jeddle. Thanks for tuning in. Today I'm going to be deconstructing another student response and providing what I hope to be some very constructive and helpful feedback that's going to allow all of you to improve your writing. Now I'm going to be looking at a couple of examples based on a specific set of texts, but you can still watch the video. I would highly recommend you still watch the video because all of the advice I'm going to be giving can be applied to any text, any essay on any particular text or set of texts. So we're mainly focusing on the writing skills, how you actually rewrite sentences, what are the common flaws, what are the common weaknesses that tend to pop up in student responses. So let's get into it. First response here, we're looking at Module A, Keats and Campion. So this is based on the English Advanced course for Year 12 in New South Wales. But again, even if you're not studying this set of texts or either of these texts, this video is still designed for you. So still tune in here, because I'm just going to be showing you how to deconstruct a question generally and how to deconstruct a paragraph, your own paragraphs, using some helpful tips and strategies. So in this case, we have the question, analyze how the texts you studied for Module A are both connected and distinguished by their individual purposes and stylistic features. Okay, so keywords in this question are pretty obvious. Connected, we're looking for connections between the two texts. In this case, Keats and Campion. And that is Keats's poetry and Campion's film Bright Star. And we're also looking at how they're distinguished. When I think about connected and distinguished, I always want to come up with some quick synonyms, some quick terms that are going to be my way of interpreting those words. So for me, connected means similarities. We want to make that as easy as possible for us to actually deconstruct the question. So make sure you give yourself a very short definition. Often it's just a synonym for interpreting the words of the question. Make sure you can think of another word that is similar enough to the word actually being asked, because that's going to help you properly understand what the question's asking, and it's going to help you implicitly throughout your response, respond in a meaningful way. Okay, so don't skip this step. Once you identify the key terms, which in this case are connected, distinguished, purposes, and stylistic features, we need to have a quick definition. You might do this in 1 second, but you still need to go through the process because it's going to make sure that you don't end up misinterpreting or misapplying the question. Okay, so connection to me is a similarity, something that is similar between the texts. Distinguished means a difference, okay? In terms of the module description, connected would mean resonance, a resonance. I would try and use that as well, but I would mainly prioritize using the word connected or connection or connect. You can use any derivative of the word, but make sure it is based on the actual keyword of the question. And then for distinguished, distinguishable. Okay, so there are derivatives of that word as well. But for me, if they're being distinguished, there's a difference. There is a dissonance potentially. Okay, so I've come up with a synonym for my own understanding, a difference. Okay, I'm looking for differences, I'm looking for similarities. And then I also have to keep in mind the particular module that's being studied, and I have to think about the key words of that rubric, of that module description. And in this case, it's resonance and dissonance. Now we have to think about similarities and differences with respect to each composer's purpose. That is why they actually constructed their text in the way they did. Why did they produce their text? Okay, so purpose, I'm thinking about context. I'm thinking about authorial intent. I'm thinking about the author's concerns. I'm thinking about the composer's concerns. I'm thinking about the composer's intention for the responder, the viewer as well. Okay, so what did the composer want to achieve by producing their particular work? Whether it's the poetry, whether it's the film. Okay, so purpose is to do with themes that they're trying to explore, the impact they're trying to have on the responder, the intent that they have in producing it from a contextual perspective, like what comment are they trying to make about their particular context. So purpose is to do with context, authorial intent, impact on the viewer or reader, and obviously the core concerns and themes that they're trying to explore. That's what purposes means to me. And notice how I interpreted that very broadly there. You should interpret those words broadly so that you can actually accommodate more of your intended draft essay, right? So you should have a draft essay that you want to use to respond to any particular question. And you need to make sure that you interpret the key terms of the question in a broad enough way so that you don't unnecessarily cut out elements of what you wanted to say. Okay, we want to make sure that if we can tie purposes into what we already said, that we do so. Because if you interpret a word in a really narrow, limited way, you're going to mistakenly disregard a lot of content that you actually were planning on talking about because you think, oh, actually what I have isn't relevant to that question. Or maybe you're just not thinking broadly enough about the key terms. And this is why you have to go through this process first of defining the terms to yourself and thinking about different ways of relating those terms to what you want to say about a particular text or a study, right? Because you'll have your own idea about what the text is about. And then you might get a question that seems to throw you. And it's like, oh, well, I wanted to talk about this theme, but the question has said to talk about that theme. But if you actually took a minute or two to break down the theme that they asked, you'd realize, oh, there's actually really strong connections between that theme and the theme that I wanted to talk about. And if I just if I just reframe my argument in terms of the key terms of the question instead of what I wanted to say directly, I can actually preserve a lot of the material and I can make a more nuanced argument that answers the question. So don't rush ahead and dismiss certain terms and dismiss certain things that you already wanted to talk about based on a draft essay or material that you had memorized. It's very likely that if you take the time to deconstruct the keywords and you think about all the things that they could relate to, that you will realize you can actually preserve a lot of your argument from a draft piece. Stylistic features to me is how it's been written, how the text has been composed. So we're talking about the form of the text. Okay, is it a film? Is it a poem? What type of poem is it? What type of film is it? The genre, what is the genre? What is the style behind the poetry, right? What is the voice of the poem? And the voice might change poem to poem. In terms of the film, what are the distinct kind of cinematographic, that's a tough word to say, cinematographic, in terms of the cinematography there. What are the film techniques, basically? Okay, what are the film techniques that have been used throughout? What are the film techniques that Campion uses a lot of? So much so that they're characteristic of the film. They are part and parcel of the style as a whole. They're the things you really want to focus in on. Remember to consider sound when you think about film. Diegetic, non-diegetic. Diegetic is sound within the film. Non-diegetic is like a soundtrack that only you can hear as the viewer, but the characters can't hear. Think about the use of light in throughout. Think about the type of shots that are used. What are some of those distinct stylistic elements, those techniques, film techniques, poetic techniques that have been used? So stylistic features to me means techniques, language features, features of a film. Talk about the genre. So we're not so much talking about the why there, we're talking about the how. So clearly we need to talk about similarities and differences between why the composers have produced their texts. Okay, so what was Keats trying to say? What was Campion trying to say? How are they similar or different? And what's different about the way that they've been composed? Well, one is a poem and one is a film. And remember, with the poetry, it's a set of poems. So I should say it's a set of poetry. You might pick out a couple as examples of that set because you can't talk about everyone typically in an essay like this. You'll pick at least two and think about how that has an impact on the meaning. Okay, great. So now that I've gone through how to deconstruct a question like this, let's have a look at this student's response. They've actually just provided a body paragraph here. So I'm going to be going through a paragraph of analysis and providing some key tips for improving your writing. Okay, so remember, it doesn't matter if you were studying Keats or Campion. This is about writing technique in general. So their topic sentence, the first sentence of the body paragraph is this: textual conversations illustrate the capacity for individuals to transcend the constraints of reality by utilizing the imagination and reflect the distinct contextual viewpoints in confronting the adversities of life. Okay, so it sounds good at first glance, right? And I'm not saying it's not good, it's got merits, but it's a little bit vague at times. We also can't see much of the key terms of the question here. I can't see the word connect. I can't see the word distinguish. I can't see the word purpose, stylistic feature. To be fair, you don't have to use the actual words purpose and stylistic feature. I would say they are words that you can just answer implicitly by actually saying what the author's purpose is and saying what the techniques are. You don't want to be saying the word purpose and feature a lot, but I would try to say connect, connection, distinguish, distinguishable, distinguish, distinguishes, right? So if you are going to have a broad textual conversation topic sentence here to begin this paragraph, then you definitely want to prioritize the actual key terms of the question. In this case, connect, connection, distinguish, distinguishable. We're talking about the textual conversation as being able to illustrate the capacity for individuals to transcend the constraints of reality and reflect the distinct contextual viewpoints. There we go, distinct contextual viewpoints that are distinguishable. right? Distinguished. Distinct is a word where we should really be trying to get distinguished in. And it's not always as simple as just substituting one word for the word of the question. Sometimes you have to rephrase what you had to work it in. You have to rephrase that whole section or even rephrase the whole sentence. But we can see there that distinct and distinguishable, clearly they both have to do with a difference. So it's important that we prioritize the actual key term over a synonym. And a little bit vague, as I said, in some parts like here, in confronting the adversities of life. Adversities of life, a little bit of a throwaway there. I would try and be much more specific when talking about things like adversities of life. I don't know that this topic sentence as a whole even responds completely to this question about distinct form and connections and things that it can be distinguished. We've got the distinct part, but it probably could be better at drawing upon what's connected and how that relates to purpose and style. So I don't want to go too much into the specifics because I'm trying to keep this general for everyone, but they're things that I would be looking at. Notice the second sentence here. While Keats proposes imagination as a mechanism of escape from reality, Campion responds through a post-structuralist lens by highlighting the transience of life and the inevitability of death. Now, before looking at the specifics there, just notice what type of sentence that is. That's like a second topic sentence. We had a topic sentence up here that was a general sentence about textual conversations. Then they've brought in a more specific one that's about Keats and Campion specifically. And then the sentence after is just on Keats. So they kind of narrow it down over 3 sentences. They say, hey, here's a sentence about the textual conversation as a whole, which, by the way, is awesome that this is doing that. But then it actually stays pretty broad and says, okay, well, here's how I'm applying that to Keats and Campion on a conceptual level, meaning it's to do with ideas. I'm not bringing any analysis in yet, no techniques, no quotes yet. And then I have a third sentence where I say, okay, here was Keats and Campion, and now it's just Keats. So it took 3 sentences to actually get to a stage where we're now ready to look at some analysis. Now, that is far too much. You might occasionally get away with the second sentence if you set it up like this, but I would think that based on what I'm reading here, you could prioritize this as the first topic sentence because you already would have made your big points here. This feels like an introductory kind of sentence, meaning it should go in your introduction. It's like a thesis. It should go somewhere in introduction where you talk about the value of the textual conversation as a whole. And I would get a little bit more to the point from the first sentence by using this as the topic sentence. And then you might have this as a second one, but I just like having a solid topic sentence that's clear and specific. And this one's pretty specific. And then if you want to say more on the context, like the romantic ideal of imagination, link that in with your first piece of analysis. So I would like to have that by the second sentence happening. So you can see that they've taken 3 sentences to get to a stage that should only take 1 or 1.5, let's say. Okay, now back up to this sentence here. This is a solid sentence in terms of being specific. Okay, here's what Keats's purpose is. Here's the distinction, and you'd probably want to try and use the word there as well, like distinguishable from Keats's purpose to propose imagination as a mechanism of escape from reality. Distinguishable from Keats's purpose to propose. That's an example of how you can work in the words of the question while still saying exactly what you want to say. We're just wording it in a different way so that we can pop that word purpose in. If we go back up here, purpose in yellow, that's an example of how you can do that. Distinguishable from Keats's purpose to propose imagination is we're going to make sure it makes sense once we read it back through, is Campion's response through a post-structuralist lens. We could even say post-structural response now. This isn't the student's fault, I'm just reworking this because of the other changes I've made. Is Campion's post-structural response that highlights the transience of life and the inevitability of death. This is the double up problem. Very common problem for students where they tend to couple things or even triple things in a list. We want to focus on one thing and one thing only when we're talking about these big concepts. And that's a general point as well. When you want to explain the meaning of something, try not to just say it means this and this and this. You're kind of diluting the importance of each particular thing, and you're conflating those terms together and you're blurring the meaning. I don't really know what exactly you're trying to say now because you've given me two things that are very similar. Life is temporary and death is inevitable. Well, they're basically the exact same thing. So it feels like you're just trying to almost convince yourself, for lack of a better phrase there, convince yourself that you're saying more than you actually are. You're actually saying the same thing twice. And that's what often happens when this double up issue occurs. So what's the solution? Avoid the use of and or as much as possible. Sometimes it will be necessary. And that often exposes a deficiency in what you're saying. Maybe you haven't said enough, but you convinced yourself you had because you had all these additional words, even though they're just repeating this first bit. That's the trick, right? You need to be conscious of that. It highlights the transience of life. Okay, so that's all you want to say? See, now it feels a bit superficial. Transience of life. Okay, life is temporary. Transient means temporary. Possibly, but make sure that you have enough depth. Make sure you're satisfied with that level of depth. So we cut that out and we reconsider what we've actually said in substance and see if we need to add any more to make it a more specific and therefore sophisticated point. Okay, so we're going to address that 3-topic sentence issue. Took too long to get to the point. Keats is seeking to escape his personal context of poor health and financial troubles by resorting to the romantic ideal of imagination. Okay, great context there, but that's a contextual point that can be linked in. That shouldn't take a whole sentence. That can be linked in with the next sentence. So that can be the beginning of the next one. You could say, reflect in Keats's attempt to escape from his personal context, or you don't even need to say his personal context. You can just say his poor health, I think. Try not to label what the thing is, like, oh, this is a context point, so I'm going to say context. Just say what it actually is. So don't say his context of poor health, just say to escape his poor health, because I already know that that's contextual. So just like when you're saying a theme or an idea, don't say Keats explores the idea of, just say what the idea is. Don't actually say the word idea or theme or concept. Avoid doing that, right? It's more sophisticated to just say what it is, not to tell me that it's an idea. We can see that it's an idea. I can tell that this is to do with his personal context. So that's just going to make it more sophisticated. That's why I'm making that point. He seeks to escape his poor health and financial troubles by resorting to the romantic ideal. So drawing upon the romantic ideal of imagination as a way of escaping his poor health and financial troubles, comma, and then we would restructure this and we don't even need to say this sentiment is echoed. See, it's just taking too long to get to the point. That's the main issue with this response, is too many sentences, too many words. We can say all of this in way less words, and that is at the heart of a sophisticated response, right? If you want to have a really well-polished essay, it needs to say everything that's important in as few words as possible, okay? So we would have an opening clause that brings in that context, and just to show you what I'm talking about there, like drawing upon the romantic ideal of imagination as a way of escaping his poor health and financial troubles, if I'm keeping that language, of escaping his poor health and financial troubles, comma, Keats employees, or we'd probably introduce the actual text. Make sure you underline it. I mean, you would normally italicize or quote it, but if you're writing this in an exam, you'll underline it to basically replace that italicized effect, which you can't really show on written paper. And then bring in your point here, right? In Ode to Nightingale, Keats talk about what he does and then bring in the first quote here. Now, what's good about, and I'll just go in here, this is all connected to the one sentence. What's good about this is that the quote that's being used is very short, and we like that, right? It's short and it's split up, which allows you to have more control and authority over the sentence. So rather than just having one long quote that's been extracted from the poem, it's been chopped up at the discretion of the student here to show more of a control and authority over how they're going to string together their argument. That's more sophisticated. That's a higher level. So if you can chop up a quote and make it work with your sentence and your argument, then you're probably going to elevate the sophistication of the response. Speakers yearning to unite with the transcendent winged dryad by metaphorically flying to thee on the viewless wings of poesy. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. But notice how the student has done something very positive here. They've actually integrated the quote in a seamless fashion. so that I didn't have to pause. We didn't need a comma before they brought in the quotes. And that's the advantage of chopping it up. They have that control over the language. They're embedding these quotes in a really seamless way, okay? Seamless meaning I don't have to pause. I don't need to put a comma there to read the quote, which is what a lot of students do. So they say, to unite with the transcendent winged dryad, I didn't have to pause there. If we were to remove the quotation marks, it still sounds like a flowing sentence, and you should always read your sentences aloud and apply that test. Does it still flow if I were to remove the quotation marks, or do I have to pause before saying my quote? By metaphorically flying to thee. Now this is beautiful because not only have they got it to flow into the quote here, by metaphorically flying, see, I didn't have to pause before saying the start of the quote here, but they've got the technique embedded here as well as part of that seamless transition. That's beautiful. I'm loving what I'm seeing here in terms of how this is being constructed. So well done to the student on this. This is good stuff. This suggests that poetic imaginations, I mean, it should just be imagination, enables one to escape from the bounds of reality to mythical, they had abodes, I've changed it to realms, to mythical realms of blissfulness and enchantment. They're too similar. Do you really need a double up there? That's the double up problem. You are convincing yourself that you're doing more than you actually are. You're just giving me two of the same. You're going to have a lot more impact, a lot more punch. You're going to have a lot more of an impression on the marker if you just eliminate the double ups and focus on one thing. And if you realize that, oh, that one thing's actually not enough, but you've convinced yourself it was enough because you just have more synonyms lined up like this, then you can actually expand on that particular idea, that one focus. Okay, so we would cut out one of these. You might choose enchantment. You don't have to choose blissfulness. Just an example. Okay, moving on from there. The ability to get lost in the imagination without wondering about the plausibility of rationality is part of Keats's philosophy of negative capability. Okay, well, I'm midway through the paragraph here, and yet now I've got this sentence that is basically summarizing Keats's philosophy. Is this meant to be like a topic sentence? Where's the analysis? Make sure if you're bringing in this commentary, which does a great job, by the way, of introducing a core contextual element, you could say, in negative capability. That's a notion coined by Keats, right? That refers to the fact that you shouldn't try to overthink things when you're figuring out the nature of something. Like if you're thinking about what's the secret of life, like don't try and use science and rationality to reason it out to get a perfect answer. Sometimes you have to revel in the uncertainty. You have to surrender to the uncertainties of life, the mysteries of life, and realize that that is our experience. That is the truth. You don't need science to get you to this one objective truth that actually can't be encapsulated by something like science or rationality. So Keats was a believer in the imagination and that there was beauty and truth to that state, that you didn't need to use science and logic to get to an answer for everything. That's what negative capability is. And it's a beautiful concept, very relevant to a Keats Campion essay. If you're talking about Keats, you should refer to negative capability because that nicely summarizes his approach to nature and the imagination. But you don't have it as a separate sentence. You should work this in and integrate it with a quote and a technique. So we need the concept, like negative capability, in the same sentence effectively as another technique or stylistic element and an explanation of what that means. Okay, and a quote. So we need the stylistic element, the quote, and the negative capability together, not all separated in different sentences, because this just feels a little bit foreign. Not foreign, but it feels a little bit like a standalone sentence, almost like a topic sentence in the middle of the paragraph. So be very careful there. Sometimes it's okay to have a sentence that doesn't have a quote or a technique if it's an extension of the previous sentence, which has a quote and technique, and it just took two sentences to explain it. But this is like a new concept. This isn't connected to the previous sentence. This is like further commentary that goes beyond just analyzing that technique. So be very careful with that. Try and integrate it in. It's going to help you be more concise. Instead of having a full sentence, just have a clause and say, as a manifestation of Keats's philosophy of negative capability, this stylistic feature in this poem or in this quote reveals this. So you want to use that kind of structure. It's tight, it's tighter, it's more to the point. But actually instead, this student has gone on to the next sentence and still not used, as far as I can see. Oh no, they have used, my apologies, they have got allusion here. They have gone on to the next sentence to use the technique, but there's that disconnect there. So I would bring those in and try and reduce both sentences and work them in together. Okay, so we really want to work on being more concise. But I do again like how the student has gone, let's read this one out. Thus, Keats calls to reverence one's own emotions instead of rationality through his allusion to the Enlightenment, suggesting that the dull brain, see how it flowed in? Suggesting that the dull brain, the quote flows in. They've been really selective and careful about that. And retards, which challenges their measured rationalization as it limits the imagination. Beautiful concept, well articulated. This student is a clever student and they've got a nice argument here, but it could be tighter in the way that they're articulating things. But honestly, like, I'm looking for things here. Besides this, it's really well worded and they've got a nice control over their language. Now have a look at this. Campion's film Bright Star deconstructs Keats' idealistic proposition from a postmodernist realist perspective. Okay, nice terms, all true, by showcasing morbidity in all its ugliness. I actually like how this is worded, even with ugliness, even though it's not the most... Well, it's a word, and it's not like a colloquial word, but I do like it. It feels like it's not a word that some people might try to find a synonym for that sounds really fancy or sophisticated. But by having ugliness, the student actually has more of their own voice here, and I'm enjoying reading that more because they use a word that feels more true to this student's perspective. So just note that. You don't always have to use the most formal, sophisticated word. Sometimes it's using words like ugliness or something like that. These kind of words, this is a very nuanced point here, but they actually give you more voice. They give you more of your own unique voice as the writer here. Okay, so I really like how they've done that. What I don't like is that this is embedded again within the same paragraph. This is a new paragraph. This is a new topic sentence here. So there's just a structural issue that was actually part of the same paragraph. At least that's how it was submitted to us when this student provided this for feedback. And we need to be mindful that these sentences that don't have techniques or stylistic elements applying to them, maybe they do in a general sense, but these ones where you're moving from one text to another, perhaps are better as a separate paragraph, especially if you've already got a couple of techniques and pieces of evidence for the other one, right? So try and have at least 3 pieces of evidence for each paragraph. So that one might need to be added to, and you might need to add a link sentence at the end there because of this restructure. But I think maybe here it would be better, instead of having this really long, bulky paragraph that's trying to cover both texts in a lot of detail, just to split them up, okay? Because unless you integrate them and you're going Keats, Campion, sentence by sentence in that order, you're better off just going Keats, new paragraph, Campion, still making links throughout. That's what seems like the better structure in this case. Now, if that was the topic sentence, then we would have the first piece of analysis, and they've gone straight into a technique, which I love to see. Sometimes you can have a little reference to context just before you get into that, so you can add a clause like reflecting something about the context, but it's already mentioned above, postmodernist realist, so maybe you would bring in something about the relevant aspects of the plot at this stage, or something about the form or style. And you could say, as an example of Keats's use of X style, and talk about a stylistic element, the mid-shot. So you're connecting a broader stylistic element to the specific technique of a mid-shot. Gives you a bit more depth, a bit more sophistication there with respect to your analysis of techniques and stylistic elements. The mid-shot of Tom in bed with low-key lighting accentuates his suffering, thereby emphasizing the inescapability of death. It's like, okay, feels a little bit abrupt because it's straight after the topic sentence, so I think that's going to be resolved by adding in a little warm-up clause there that either contextualizes that scene a little bit more. Like, I feel like you've just thrown me into some random scene in the film, and it's come as the first piece of evidence from Campion's film Bright Star. Like, you've thrown me in the deep end there a little bit. Like, just tell me what's going on just prior to that, or ground that in the broader plot of the film so that I can like follow that mid-shot, I can contextualize it, I can understand where that fits into the film, right? Help me out, help me understand why that's there at the front as well. But the other thing to note is you're saying accentuates, which means emphasizes. This is your first piece of evidence that you brought in for Campion. Far too abrupt, right? How is this something already accentuating something else? What are you accentuating? Nothing else has been said. So careful with your use of verbs. Don't just throw things in randomly. You could say highlights, reveals. I even like establishes it might not be the best word here for establishes his suffering, but you could say like reveals the extent of his suffering, right? I just feel like that's a lot better than saying accentuates, which means emphasizes, which often would come after you've already said something else. We want a smoother start at the beginning there. In addition's fine. Moreover, furthermore, that's fine. The zoomed in shot of Keats's bloodstained towel. And again, don't forget to also analyze sound with a film. Don't just talk about shots. You need to talk about lighting. You need to talk about dialogue. You also need to talk about soundtracks, things that can be heard only by the viewer, right? Music that plays in the background. You need to talk about the mise-en-scene, how particular shots are set up, costuming, positioning, background, foreground. That's mise-en-scene stuff. Okay, so you got kind of mise-en-scene, the shots and angles, right, of the camera, the lighting, how scenes have been set up from a lighting perspective, and you've also got sound, which has non-diegetic sound, which can only be heard by the viewer, and diegetic sound, which is like dialogue, because the characters can actually hear that. In addition, the zoomed in shot of Keats's bloodstained towel authentically depicts, now there's no need for a comma there, the zoomed in shot of that authentically depicts, well, I don't know why there's a comma there, I don't have to pause for that. That shot depicts the painful experience of tuberculosis, which cannot be escaped through imagination. Not bad. Try and embed some quotes, even though it's a film and you want to focus more on those, dialogue's still important. If you can embed an aspect of the dialogue into that sentence, that might enhance it. You don't have to do it, but I think at least contextualize the scene. I think that's why I was feeling, in terms of the technique here, was feeling a little bit vague again, like hard to follow. You've just given me a zoomed in shot of his bloodstained towel. When? Where? Like, when? Where? One issue we've seen in the last couple of sentences is you need to contextualize your evidence so we know roughly where you're talking about, where you're referring to, not what you're referring to, where you're referring to in the film. Like, you don't need a whole sentence to storytell. Don't tell me, oh, this happens in the film. Just say, as this happens, this shot does this, okay? It's just going to help us out. It's going to help us understand where you are. It's just feeling a little bit abrupt with this structure of saying, the technique does this. It's like, whoa, okay, how did we get there? What was happening? What's this connected to more broadly in terms of the film's concerns? How does this relate to what you just said above? Okay, so it feels a little bit thin in terms of satisfying, the requirements of having something that is cohesive and really ties in with the other sentences, and also doesn't leave the reader lost as to what and where you're talking about in the text. Eventually, the speaker in Ode to a Nightingale comes to an acceptance of these limitations by personifying the imagination as a deceiving elf. Beautiful job of getting the flow on by using as a deceiving elf. Good selection of quote and well structured. Concluding that the products of one's imagination do not exist in objective reality. So some fantastic points are made by this student. Again, this student, in my mind, is of a band 6 potential. They're of an A grade potential, right? Top band. But they could just execute the structure a bit better using some of the tips that I've gone through here. You can see as well, when we come down here, Campion mirrors Keats's acknowledgement of the deficiencies of the imagination by showcasing his acceptance of the tragic fate of his relationship. It's like we've got this random conceptual statement now wedged between the analysis. Unless this is an extension of what you just had and you make that clear by saying, like, here, Campion mirrors that, or if you were to say however, which means you're going on to a different point, it's feeling more like a topic sentence, meaning you can make this point, but you should work it in with the technique, with the next thing of dim lighting, right? So these just feel a little bit isolated, a little bit unnecessary as a full sentence in the middle of a paragraph, okay? You're going to really struggle word count-wise, timing-wise to get everything done if these kind of things are taking full sentences up. So that's the issue there. The next sentence goes into more technique, which is great. Dim lighting and close-up. You can see why we had to split this up. I mean, imagine if all this was one paragraph. I mean, that's an enormous paragraph. And from a structural point of view, you would probably lose marks by default because it's just too long. You haven't shown a control of your argument and being able to separate key points so that we can follow things in a logical way, right? If it's all clumped together, then it's very hard to follow the overall point of each paragraph. Okay, so Try and mix up the structure so you're not always just saying the technique, right? Even though you said a couple of things there and you have talked about lighting in this case, because you don't want to just talk about shots every time. You need to diversify the range of techniques that you refer to. But try to mix up your structure as well, so you're not always starting with it. Maybe you start with the point and then say revealed through halfway through the sentence and bring in the evidence in the second half of the sentence. So consider that. Now, when you have these kind of sentences where you're focusing on film techniques that don't require quotes, again, it might help to bring in or embed quotes, even if it's just one word or a very short phrase from either Keats's poetry or the film, right? That can supplement your analysis here, okay? It's going to show a deeper textual engagement if you can bring in quotes throughout, even if they're not quotes that you're analyzing for the purpose of finding a technique. So you don't have to use quotes just as evidence of techniques. You can use quotes to actually complement your analysis and show that deeper textual engagement that you're constantly drawing from the text, not just in terms of finding techniques, but in terms of articulating your argument through your voice, but also through the voice of the characters or the poet or the director. Okay, so we want to try and embed some quotes in here because otherwise it's feeling a little bit empty of analysis, of textual engagement. And we want to have contextualization of these scenes. Now here, they've said during the goodbye scene. That's probably the most context they provided in the last 3 pieces of analysis we've looked at, so that's good. Make sure you do that with the other ones and do it in different ways so it's not getting repetitive in terms of how you're wording things. Going on, this is a very long paragraph, by the way, as well. Whilst the couple temporarily used their imagination, you say used. Maybe it's going to make more sense if you do users, we'll see. Often I like to talk about things in present tense, unless it's very deliberate in terms of the past tense there. Whilst the couple temporarily uses their imagination to escape the financial and social constraints that kept them apart, Keats's comforting of Fanny through the dialogue. Okay, we'll do use. Now, at this stage, they didn't get the seamless transition. Keats's comforting of Fanny through the dialogue. We must see how to pause through the dialogue. We must cut these threads. We'd want to work on getting that. So a little bit more effort here required, but you've put in the effort. This student's put in the effort for the other ones. It's like for this one, they just didn't figure out a way of tying it in. So I'd encourage you to continue that trend because it's going to keep the sophistication high. Reflects the speaker in Ode to a Nightingale and disrupts their imagined state, highlighting the reality of Keats's imminent death. Okay, nice wording, nice language, nice control of language, but make sure that if you are talking about dialogue, right, that's kind of the only technique in this sentence, it seems. And dialogue in and of itself isn't that specific at all in terms of a technique. Like using dialogue in a film, I wouldn't say that that is a notable technique. You need to tell me something about that dialogue. I mean, here it says we must cut these threads, so I can see high mode. I could add high modal dialogue because it's high modality. It's definitive. We must, right? It's high modal. So already that would improve it a little bit by actually giving me a technique to do with the dialogue, not just saying there's dialogue. And I would also try and complement it with something more broadly about the visual techniques or auditory techniques, something that ties into the film. Constantly try and come back to those and group them together rather than just relying on dialogue in any one sentence. Okay, thus while Campion collides with Keats's proposition of escape through the imagination, she translates his eventual acceptance of its limitations. That just felt a little bit unfinished at the end, so I said through what? How does she do that? How does Campion translate his acceptance of its limitations? Feels like you should say through or via and talk about the form or the perspective offered there. So link to the distinct cinematic form. Tell me something specific about it. It might only be a few more words at the end of this sentence. And make sure you include the actual terms of the question. I'm not seeing connect, distinguishable. Try and come back to those where you can. You don't have to use stylistic features or purpose a lot, but you should try and, especially in the topic sentences and links, make a conscious effort to include the actual key terms in a meaningful way. Anyway, that's the feedback for today, for this video, for this student. I hope that helps you all. If you are interested in getting one-on-one feedback from myself and some of Jeddle's most experienced markers and teachers and tutors, then make sure you check out the link in the description because we're running workshops for very small groups where we do this kind of feedback. We make sure all your essays are ready to go in time for the HSC trials and other exams, depending on what year you're in. But go to that link to see all of our upcoming workshops where you can get the one-on-one feedback. Strongly recommend it. Otherwise, make sure you go to jeddle.com for our most extensive resources to help you build these essays and to help you improve your writing. Until then, thanks so much for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and comment below. Thanks so much.